Salvate omnes, and welcome to Latin 101 at Campbell University. This is your teacher, instructor, professor, philosopher, grammarian, and bad golfer, all in one. Um, as a rule, this will be the format of instruction. Nice thing about Latin, technology actually makes sense. For Latin, whereas a modern language, I think it would not, um, given the fact that a modern language is spontaneous and focuses on communicative proficiency, whereas Latin largely is reading. And so I think you'll find this format sensible. As a rule, and I indicated this in my first email to you all, and I'll continue to repeat this, you'll want to watch this video at your convenience. It should cover the content, the main content in each chapter. And of course, the content that we cover in these video tutorials are going to be on your 3-unit tests. More about that later. As a rule, we will do one chapter per week. So you will see, for example, this particular chapter is pretty short. And so I think you'll find this chapter very easy in terms of the content that needs to be learned. As you can imagine, Latin can be very hard if you're doing unadapted Latin, if you're doing Virgil or Cicero or Ovid. It's like learning Shakespeare. But I think you'll find the Wheelock's Latin sensible and also hopefully interesting. Here we have some famous writers who also appreciated the learning of Latin. So you want to look at that. And indeed, you'll want to, I think, browse the opening introduction just to familiarize yourselves with how the Wheelock's Latin was organized. It's based on classical authors. So I think it has an intrinsic intellectual literary interest. And then don't forget, just as a kind of footnote here, if you ever have any questions about what we're doing, you'll post your questions on Blackboard discussion for the week. And then feel free to come by in person at Campbell University, D. Rich 127, for questions. You can come by during my German class, which I teach Tuesday, Thursdays, 6:30 to 7:50. So we have some flexibility. Sometimes learning, it's a little bit easier to ask and answer questions in person. So if that fits your schedule and it seems easier to communicate in person, please feel free to stop by during one of my German classes. So as you'll see here, you want to sort of browse this and you'll sort of instantly recognize the importance of Latin. This one's kind of sideways here. This is a screen. By the way, I'm using a program called Screencast-O-Matic, which I think works. And then I'll be uploading this to a YouTube channel. So I'm just going to keep this sideways for now. But you can see the position of Latin for Indo-European languages. Generally, there are 2 language trees. We have the Indo-European and then the Ungaric Asiatic. For example, the Eastern languages. My wife's from Finland. Finnish is also an Ungaric Asiatic language. But when it comes to Western languages, you can see the position and importance of Latin for English, French, Italian, Spain, Portuguese, and Romanian. And when you take Latin and Germanic languages, of course, we should think of Western civilization. And so hence the importance of Latin just for the development, along with Greek, of course, but along with Anglo-Saxon world in the more modern age in particular. When we think of Western civilization in its broad sense, Latin is one of its origins, if you will. Indeed, the word civilization is Latin. So take a look at that. I think it has intrinsic interest. And then, once again, this is something I would ask you to, to read on your own, to get familiar with this language, so that when I mention this language in the videos, if you haven't learned another language previously, you'll be comfortable with some of the grammatical terminology we'll be using. For example, we'll talk in passing or at times even in greater detail about derived or derivatives. And don't confuse that with cognates, but derivatives are words like a river, because rivus means river in Latin, as you can see here. De means from. So, for example, devolve is the opposite of evolve. Or derivation, deviant. Deviant literally means from the way. So, a naughty person, to use British English, is someone who's perhaps deviant. That is to say, their ways are a little bit wayward or off the way. But these are words in English, and in this particular case, that come from Latin words. It depends on your sources. As you know, this thing is always evolving, but approximately 50, maybe 55, some would say 60% of words in English do come from Latin. Another large percentage, of course, from German, and in particular academic words, words in the law, words in medicine, words in philosophy, although that was largely an adaptation of Greek thought. But when we think of the law or politics, for example, the word Senate or even the word president, these are all words that come from Latin. Indeed, many of you who are in the sciences, Latin is important. I should say this particular course focuses more on literary, philosophical Latin, not so much modern Latin, but hopefully you'll find those connections with your more modern disciplines. So take a look at that. Here you can sort of see, again, Latin is the mother, and I would argue that, again, I teach a modern language, and so I have great appreciation of modern languages, but anytime you go back to the sources, I think it's interesting and important. And so obviously these are important languages, but they all come from the mother tongue of Latin. Once again, emphasizing Latin's importance for Indo-European languages. So take a look at this, read this as well, so you have some schema or some orientation for the authors. Again, our Latin is based on classical authors, and so if we mention somebody like Seneca, you need to be able to recognize that this is part of the Silver Age, where if we mention somebody like Ovid, that's still going to be part of the Golden Age. You're not going to be tested on any of this, but still, it's important to have some understanding of history. It'll contribute to a greater understanding and appreciation of the language of that period. Let's see. So please read this when you can, just to better understand how the book is organized. I will say that I don't know so much about this particular semester, but maybe at some point we'll talk about medieval Latin. Medieval Latin in many ways is a little bit easier than classical Latin, which will be our focus. But maybe at times we'll take a sort of detour and explore some medieval Latin. I will say that generally speaking, because I've taught this class many times, including in person, but Latin 101 and 102 are going to be fairly, not easy, but fairly straightforward. It's not really until you get to the 200 level, and this is true of any language class, where the level of difficulty goes up slightly. And if one has not mastered or is not as proficient as one perhaps ought to have been in the earlier classes, that's where you start to see, doesn't matter if it's Latin, Spanish, French, or German, or whatnot, you start to see great separation in people's abilities. But sort of that'll give you a little bit of confidence. You have about a year, if you will, Latin 101 and 102 to really, I think you'll find the Latin not too difficult. And it's not really until second year Latin that things, go up in level of difficulty. Okay, so let's see here. We'll largely be doing the ecclesiastical Latin. Again, I'm a philosopher. I have a PhD in philosophy from Duke. I always studied languages in order to read Cicero in Latin or to read Nietzsche in German. So for me, I really appreciate languages, but for me, my training, it was, for research and scholarship and great books, reading it in the original language, not just translation, which is helpful, but of course it's a source of a source. Hence, you lose something anytime you're copying or imitating. Alphabet, again, these are, I'm not a linguist. Maybe some of you study linguistics. You might find these aspects interesting. I tend to not focus on them just because it's not really part of my background and professional training. But you'll see, for example, that Latin lacked the letter J and the letter W. And so you'll see that sometimes in the pronunciation. Those of you who had Latin before, every textbook is different. Some will use the letter V, as our book does. Other textbooks may use the letter U. For example, Julius Caesar's Wani Widi Wiki, I came, I saw, I conquered. Kind of a mixture of the V and the U. Wani Widi Wiki. And so it's something to keep in mind. But generally, alphabet and pronunciation do not pose big issues for students, especially university students. Little fun footnote. I actually teach high school students Latin, and we were all there once, but their maturity level is all over the place, as you can imagine. So some of them appreciate Latin, others they're not really sure what they're doing, and so it's kind of interesting to see just how far you guys have come. Even though I don't know you, just think back to high school to today, and just how much more mature you are intellectually, and hopefully you'll appreciate Latin on that intellectual level. Which, when one is younger, one might know more Latin, but that doesn't necessarily mean that one understands more. Okay, let's see here. Vowels, again, please read through this. Again, big picture, or at least for our purposes, you're not going to be tested on your pronunciation. Although the book points out it is probably important to read these aloud. Remember, Latin originally was a spoken language, and of course, reading it aloud is using another sense, and it's going to help you learn it. It's going to slow you down a little bit, but of course, you know how you learn best. But I think that's one way to understand why they're spending a little bit of time talking about the sounds in Latin. A lot of people do learn by sounds, music, and not necessarily through analysis. So my approach will be very grammatical and analytical and even intellectual. That's going to work for most people, especially at the university level. But I mentioned my younger students a moment ago, my style of teaching, because I've taught in higher ed for 25 years. My style of teaching is different than they're used to, perhaps, and so sometimes I get a dazed, a confused look about some of my explanations. All right, so take a look at that. We're going to move forward here to talking about the alphabet, accent. Again, Latin is a very phonetic language. Even here we have Horace's famous the Roman writer. He was born in 65 BC and died in 8 AD. Carpe diem, seize the day. Carpe Latinam, seize Latin. So you can see right there, Carpe diem, Carpe Latinam. I will not tend to exaggerate my Latin pronunciation, although I probably should. So maybe Carpe diem, Carpe Latinam. So that would actually be a little bit better, because this is called a macron, macron, and basically it means a long vowel. And so just make it a long vowel, twice as long as you might normally do it, and you'll be pronouncing these words more correctly. Here's some maps. Again, if we had a class in person, we would spend more time on these important but adjacent topics from the language itself. But given our online virtual format, if you will, I think it's we just lack the flexibility to do those things, in my view. So we're going to focus largely on the language, and yeah. Let's see. Let's talk about this chapter here. So caput, this is where we get the word capital. So I mentioned this is the letter V, but if you change it to a U, some books will do. So Caput Unus, and the way the book is organized, some of you may have had background in Latin, but the Wheelocks is a grammar translation approach, which has, like any approach, it has both pros and cons. I'll say again, I've said this several times, for our format, since it's online, I think it's a pro because it tends to be, you can do a lot of self-study with this approach, whereas other approaches, would be more content, for example, the reading approach, but it might be difficult to learn as much not being in person with that approach. So every chapter begins with an introduction of the grammar topic in that chapter, or in this case, several topics. So we have verbs, we have first and second conjugations, adverbs, reading and translating. So we'll talk about these things. One of the nice things about Latin I discovered is, and this is not true of a modern language, indeed most things, because it's a dead language, if you will, you kind of do the same thing over and over again. And so it doesn't matter if we're doing chapter 1 in Latin 101 at Campbell University in 2023, or if you're studying for AP Latin exam based on Virgil and Caesar, or maybe you want to read Ovid's Metamorphoses in the original. You kind of do the same thing over and over again in terms of analysis and understanding. The difference, of course, is different vocabulary. So the point I'm trying to make is that if you don't have a background in Latin, it might take 2 or 3 chapters to get comfortable, one, with the way the book is organized, 2, with my style of teaching, and then even more importantly, just with Latin more generally. And so just sort of be patient, and you're not going to miss anything, strictly speaking, because Latin, it's always about understanding the endings, as we'll talk about pretty much every time we have a lesson. So sort of keep that in mind. That should give you some confidence. Unlike a lot of classes, let's be honest, once you get behind, you're trying to catch up, and then like in sports, you spent all that energy catching up, and then you just get behind. And sometimes that can be challenging. With Latin, you're never really behind because you're always sort of in the present of reading, analyzing, and translating. So let's talk about this. You want to read through this on your own. My general approach will be to kind of highlight some of the important concepts and then go into the exercises themselves. In other words, content that you'll be tested on. And then try to explain those concepts by reference to the concepts introduced in the first part of each chapter. So familiarize yourselves with the grammar concepts in each chapter is going to be important because I'm going to be referring to this grammatical terminology. So if I say, okay, this is a verb of the first conjugation, third person singular, it ends in T, ama, it means he or she loves. Notice I just threw a lot of grammatical terminology at you that is explained in each chapter, but it may take a little while to get used to that approach. Ultimately, Latin is also interesting because not everybody is going to, if you will, be as amenable to a grammatical approach. So you can just memorize it. In fact, for many, many years, as I tell my high school students, they're living in luxury. They have iPads, they have books, they have paper. Pretty much until the 20th century, very few students had any of that. And they seem to learn just fine. In fact, in some cases, probably even more so because they had less distractions. So you had to memorize it. So if you put it in memory, in one sense, that is learning. There is no knowledge without memory, as the Romans and ancients knew very well. Okay, so let's take a look at this here. One of the things that we're talking about in this chapter is a verb. And what is a verb? Well, we all learned that back in kindergarten, first grade. It's an action or a state of being. So it's very important. And in English, we all started with subject verb. So, for example, Sally is happy. We all started, I think, our schooling with those simple examples. One of the things that Latin will do, not so much in the first chapter as we move forward, is that Latin will put the verb at the end, whereas English likes subject, verb, object. As we'll see, Latin often uses subject, object, verb. And so we have to be able to recognize the verb in a sentence, and oftentimes it's at the end. But then, as you'll see, we have to understand the person, number, and tense. And so again, you want to read through this, and what it comes down to is, I think mood and voice at this point is maybe making things too complex. Mood and voice. So this would be the subjunctive and the passive. Um, you don't need to worry about this until Latin 201. So let's just kind of simplify things. And again, if you want to, for you grammar nerds out there, great. But really, this is, I think, just throwing too much at us. We have to conjugate verbs. What does conjugate verbs? Well, we indicate the person, number, and tense. So in English, we have I speak, you speak, he speaks. We speak, you speak, they speak. So notice in English, especially in present tense, we often just add an S in the third person singular. But if you go back to Chaucer's English, right, like thou hast and thou doth, notice that earlier English did have endings, but especially in American English, we tend not to use those. But we need to get familiar with first person singular, second person singular, and third person singular, or first person singular, first person plural, or second person singular, second person plural, or third. And so basically it's I, you, he, or she. In fact, I'm not sure. This is a like a Kindle version that I'm using on Amazon. Clearly, this is wrong, right? Because we is plural, and so there's a mistake here. And so just change that here. I'm not sure how that got by the editor, but it did. So I is first person singular. You is second person singular. He or she or it is third person singular. We is first person plural. You all is second person plural. And they is third person plural. So it is important to learn that. There is I don't think you need this, but if you want to have a little extra confidence, there is a book you can buy on Amazon. It's called English Grammar for Students of Latin. They have it for every language, but it's not real expensive. And even if you bought it with a friend, it's just going to cost you a couple dollars. It is helpful, especially if you feel like you need those comparisons between English and Latin. Again, it's called English Grammar for Students of Latin. You can get it on Amazon. It is a useful source and to give you a little bit more confidence. So as I keep saying, you'll want to read through these concepts. When we get later when we get deeper into the book, I will actually go through this in a more deliberate manner, namely the introductory material. Right now, many of you are so new to Latin, I'm not sure it would be beneficial to do that without just going right into the examples, especially for this first chapter. So here, now we're finally getting to something important in terms of what we're going to need to know for this chapter. So you can see here's osmos tisnit. So I'm going to be saying that often. Osmos tisnit. That's our mnemonic device. A verb that ends in O is first person singular. A verb that ends in S is second person singular. A verb that ends in T is third person singular. He, she, it. A verb that ends in mus is first person plural. A verb that ends in tis is second person plural. A verb that ends in nunt is third person plural. So you're going to see that Latin uses a base or a stem, and it attaches these endings. Why? Because many of you know Latin is an inflected language. So in order to learn Latin, you have to learn a number of endings. And so I'm going to give you an example of all the different endings that one would need to know and you will learn in order to really learn Latin. And then by reading and practice, you learn the base or the stem, i.e. vocabulary. And then the trick in learning Latin is to understand that the endings determine the meaning, but then the words determine the forms. And what I mean by that is that in English, we don't have, English creates meaning by word order. So if we say that I am sending a card to my mother, if I say the card is sending me to my mother, notice we understand that because it's a simple sentence, but just we know it's the word order is off, so the meaning is all messed up. In Latin, you can put sentences pretty much in any order because it's not the word order, but the endings. But here's the thing is that in English, if we misspell a word, it's not the biggest grammar mistake, quite frankly. In Latin, if we misspell a word because we don't have the right endings, it changes the meaning. And that's a cardinal mistake. So in Latin, you have to learn I, autumn, is, o, e, autumn, is, blank, ebos, ebos, ace. And so I could go on and on. Osmos, tisnet, east, emos, eastis, erant, bo, bibi, woo, bombay, smart, bamos, bates, mon, aris, tur, mun, mani, nuntur. And what I did right there, I just gave you a blitz grammatic of a lot of different endings. And you have to memorize all those endings and then put them in different combinations. And that's how Latin works. And that's why Latin is called an inflected language. Um, Again, if you look at your appendix in the back of your Wheelock's Latin, you'll see a list of all these different forms. But this chapter, we just need to learn osmos tisnet. And everything is in the present tense until further notice. So right now, what I'm really trying to emphasize is osmos tisnet for present tense verbs. These are the endings. And everything's going to be present tense. So don't worry about past tense or future tense. That's a pro tip on the test. Don't put any of the verbs in any tense except and only present tense. Otherwise, it would be wrong. Okay. The other grammar concept in here is the infinitive. What is an infinitive? Well, basically it means to in English. So, to err is human in Latin. That is errare humanum. And so notice that Latin just says errare. So Latin doesn't use to. Errare humanum est would be the Latin for to err is human. So English uses a lot of extra words. Those of you who've had Latin before, as a rule, there's going to be less words in Latin than English because English uses extra words, as you'll see, including prepositions, whereas Latin doesn't. And that'll be part of the trick in learning how to translate is one's English needs to be... So Latin will improve your English because you're going to be required to write good English for the Latin because if your translation is wrong, it's not the Latin. The Latin is fine, but it's your English that needs further attention. So in my experience, you could say that for many, it's not so much the Latin that is the problem, but their English. And so I think that's a practical benefit of learning Latin. It'll allow you guys to, if needed, to tidy up your English a bit. Okay, so what is an infinitive? Well, we mentioned a moment ago we had osmos tisnet. But now we have infinitives. What's an infinitive? Well, an infinitive in the first, second conjugation, because remember that's the grammar in this chapter, are verbs that end in ARE for first conjugation and ERE for the second. And then notice there's a long vowel macron. And so we need the root or the stem. And so that's one of the themes that's going to take some getting used to is Latin uses endings, including for verbs as well as nouns and adjectives, and all words indeed, except for adverbs, which tend to be fixed forms. But here we take off the ARE and we're left with LAUD. So we take off the ERE and we're left with MON, but we need a vowel to make it pronounceable. So as a rule, we put back the key vowel. And then we add our osmos tisnet. So an infinitive can mean to, which we use. For example, if I say I want to learn Latin, in Latin that would be volo Latinam discere. So notice I'm using discere as my infinitive. But the infinitive also forms the base or the root of the present stem and hence is used for the conjugation of present tense verbs. So again, all this is explained in this chapter. There's also a good website called, or videos rather, called latintutorial.com. If you just go to YouTube, this young man, right, actually I don't know how young he is anymore, but he put together a series of video tutorials, if you will, that are really helpful. Now it does use different vocabulary than we often use, but LatinTutorial.com is kind of your one-stop YouTube video source, for a little extra practice for pretty much everything we do. So if you just go LatinTutorial.com and then just indicate or just Google in your search infinitives, he'll explain this as well. So take a look at that. And then, so now we have a chart. So again, we kind of skipped ahead here, but we're going to do that for the first couple of weeks. So laudare, Laudare, is the infinitive. But then we drop it. But then we got to add os most tisnit. So there's OST, most tisnit. But we have to add the key vowel. Where it gets a little bit tricky, and this will just require memorization, is you don't add an A here. Why? You just don't, right? And after a while, it'll become intuitive in terms of pronouncing. So laudo means I praise. Laudes, you praise. Laudat, he, she, it praises. Laudemus, we praise. Laudatis, you praise. Laudant, they praise. One of the things that you need to note is that notice Latin just has one form. English, this could be translated as I praise, I am praising, I do praise. So this is where English grammar is very complex compared to Latin. Believe it or not, English grammar is very complex. Why? Because it comes from other languages. So English comes from Latin and German, so we shouldn't be surprised that English is, one, has a huge vocabulary, two, is a little bit more complex because you have two mighty rivers of languages creating one, if you will. Laudo, by the way, that was part of Shakespeare's genius, who he knew Latin and Greek, and so he used the classics in order to, if you will, create his own English. So laudo, I praise, I am praising, do praise. Take a look at this one here. So monare is to advise. But we drop the ERE, but we need the E to make it pronounceable. But then we just add our os most tisnit. So os most tisnit. And so keep that in mind, that this paradigm, os most tisnit, which we will use pretty much in every lesson, in every chapter, is in chapter 1, and it's fundamental for learning. Another thing to notice is that, notice that Latin often doesn't use a separate subject. So English, notice we have to add these pronoun subjects. So we have to add I, you, he, we, you all, or they. Latin just has one word. So for example, laudo can mean I am praising. Well, that's one word in Latin. That's 3 words in English. Another good one is Anno Domini, which means in the year of our Lord. So AD means in the year of our Lord, Anno Domini. Notice that Latin has 2 words, anno, A-N-N-O, Domini, D-O-M-I-N-I, whereas English, in the year of our Lord. So English has 6 words, Latin only 2 words. So that's important to keep in mind, and also why oftentimes Latin is good for academic work, because it's more precise than English often is. And it tends to lend itself to a kind of aphoristic style, which, a lot of sayings, and a lot of, I think a lot of people get tattoos in Latin just because maybe it's less painful, maybe there's less words. Never had a tattoo, but that might be a fun way to think about this. All right, so let's go here. Please read through this. We have one more grammar concept, and again, all this goes back to, just to kind of remind us what we're doing here. All this goes back to the main topic of the chapter, which is verbs. So we have another verb. So far we've had the indicative and the infinitive, but now we have the imperative. So we have indicative verbs, we have infinitive verbs, and we have imperative verbs all in this chapter. Imperative, of course, is giving commands. And how do we form the imperative in Latin, well, we had monere, which means to advise, and then we had monio, mones, monet, monimus, monetis, monent for our osmos tisnit, but now we just drop the osmos tisnit and we drop the ending, and then we have a kind of a shortened form of the verb, and notice that means advise me or save me. This one is pretty easy to identify because it has an exclamation point. And it starts with the verb. Remember, we said most indicative or simple sentences in Latin, the verb is at the end. If you see a verb in the beginning and you have an exclamation point, you can probably surmise that it is imperative. Let's see here. Here's three good examples. So non-valet, she is not well. So why? How do we know she? Because it's third person singular, because osmos tisnet, T is third person singular. Here's a good example too. Two words, but you can see the verb is at the end and the T means she or he, depending on the context. Notice that is well is valet. So English has 1, 2, 3, 4. The Latin only has 2 words. So again, that might be the challenge for some of you, is you're going to feel like Latin can often feel or seem like there's something missing. Why? Because it seems like we're missing words. And so you have to fill that in with your imagination and your study of Latin in order to get that translation. But it's not even just translation, otherwise you're not going to know what you're doing or what you're imagining or thinking. And so we need to have some image and some understanding of what this means. And this is where Latin, lends itself to translation. The downside of it is that Latin can turn into, kind of translation exercises, which again, some people like, some people don't. And there's no easy answer for that. Ultimately, we're trying to learn and understand and grow our sense of meanings and languages and history, all the things you're doing in your other classes. And so you have to kind of figure out what works for you. Ultimately, the goal is to, not just, this won't be our goal, but the goal is to be able to read Latin. And like anything else, it takes a while to learn how to do that. Here's another example is me saepe laudant. So nt means they. And then saepe means often. And then they often praise me. Remember, this could also mean they are often praising me, or they do often praise me. So Latin doesn't distinguish. You'll have to experiment on the test. As long as you get it in the present tense, it's fine. So whether you do it in simple present or present continuous, I'm not going to focus too much on that, to be honest with you. Although that is important, but I think I'm just going to simplify it for us. And the important thing is to get it in the right tense. And then we have, here they give you a translation, but you, let's see, somebody's calling me. I think it's, maybe it's one of my friends asking me about Latin. Okay, probably not. Mones me non saepe. S means you. Me means me. Not means non. And saepe means often. Okay. So there we go. Vocabulary, vocabula. You're not going to have a test this week. As a rule, you'll have a test every 3 weeks. There will be a vocabulary section on each test where I'll give you a word bank and you have to match the Latin with the English. So for example, if you see nihil on the test and the word bank says nothing, you would match nothing with nihil, or non for not. So vocab is pretty important. Shakespeare's easy if you know the vocab. If not, it's like hieroglyphics. And so another way to think about Latin is learn the vocab. And then all the other stuff, grammar, translation, things we've been mentioning thus far are a lot easier. Me quid nihil non. Now there is a, and I'll probably send the link for this sooner rather than later. There is a companion website for the Wheelock's Latin, and it's kind of old-fashioned by today's standards, but there are audio files that that have the vocab that give you kind of like may quit, and so they kind of do it in the classical Latin. Whereas I'll be honest with you, sometimes I Americanize my accent. But feel free to use that companion website and those audio files, if you, especially if you learn by sound, which a lot of people do, and we all do, but some people more so than others. So hearing it pronounced correctly on that website, um, might help you learn these words. But we do need to learn the words. Um, Saipe, often, see, conjunction. Again, we're going to kind of bracket this. Amo, amare, amavi, amatum. I'm using a Kindle version. Your book looks different. For some reason, the vowels in this Kindle version, they're kind of funky. But this is an A with a macron. But you can see through here, but just use your book here too, if you're wondering why it's in that funny point or font. So, amo, amare, amavi, amatum. Now, this is important. The words in italics, these are possible translations. So the words in parentheses, those are derivatives or words in English that come from the Latin word. So amo can mean I love or I like, and you just choose one based on the context. But you can see we get words amorous, amatory, and maybe some of you have a name, Amanda, which all come from the Latin word amo, amare, amavi, amatum. If you're wondering why, these are called the principal parts. Now, we're not going to talk about that today, but this is actually fairly important in Latin. You need to learn all four words, even though I'm not going to explain why at this point. It becomes very important later. We have this in English. I know, I knew, I have known. Notice that's three different spellings or forms. But in English, we generally don't learn them together. We learn them separately. Latin, it is important to learn them as vocabulary. And if you can do that, one, you might be tested on it in terms of vocab. But two, it's going to make Latin 201 a lot easier, as you'll see next year. So try to learn all these so-called principal parts for reasons which will be more obvious next year. Cogito, cogitare, cogitavi, cogitatum. Those of you who study philosophy, Descartes' cogito ergo sum, I think therefore I am, coming right from Latin. Fun fact, Descartes himself, actually being a modern philosopher, was skeptical of the value of learning Latin. But of course, perhaps his most famous saying it was in Latin. So it's like anything else. Is as I tell my high school students who are reluctant thinkers, is Socrates spent his whole life learning before he decided that he did not know. So it's okay not to like, but first, why don't you learn something, as I tell them, before you decide you're not interested in it. So Descartes learned Latin before he decided that, well, Latin is great, but mathematics and French, are more just as good, if not better, given the conditions of the modern world. Debio, debere, debui, debitum. Some of you, this is where we get the word debt. So again, this could mean, so debio can mean I owe, or I ought, I must, or should. So again, you got to choose one based on the context. But the words debt, debit, due, and duty all come from Latin. Do dare dedidatum. Again, it can mean, so do means to give or I offer. By the way, fun fact, it is often the fourth principal part where a lot of English words, so this is where we get the word data, so D-A-T. And as you're probably discovering, it is the root or the stem of the Latin words that give rise to the English words. So the endings, those tend to be unique for each language. So you have to kind of drop the UM, if you will, but you have D-A-T, 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 D-A-T. Excuse me. Let's see. Coffee break. 1 second. Erro, errare, erravi, erratum. Laudo, laudare, laudavi, laudatum. Monio, monre, moni, monitum. Salvio, salvere, salve, salvite. Servo, servare, servavi, servatum. Conservo, conservare, conservavi, conservatum. Terrio, terrere, terrui, territum. Maybe some of you have a terrier. We have a terrier ourselves, dog. Valio, valere, valui, valiturum. So you want to study this. Of course, there's Quizlets and other things that can make this perhaps a little bit more active. Again, if we were in class, we might do some hangman or some other kind of fun games, so to speak. But this is something, given our format, you just have to study on your own. But making flashcards the old good old fashioned way, writing it out, that's not exciting. It's still the best way to learn. Many of you are in the hard sciences. Again, I did my PhD at Duke, so I know all about research. I think important for research is trying to learn to slow it down. One has to learn how to to write and to think and to work carefully in order to avoid silly mistakes. And so Latin is no different. Slow it down, write the words down, say it slowly, moneo, monare, monoi, monitum, and really kind of exaggerate, like sports, go through the motions slowly, deliberately, build that memory, that muscle memory. Valete, video, videre, vidi, visum. So I came, I saw, I conquered, Julius Caesar, veni, vidi, vici, voca, vocare, vocavi, vocatum. And again, you look at all the English words that come from Latin. Okay. So I mean, some people might confuse evoke and invoke. So do you know the difference? Right. So Latin can help you review that. Okay. So again, first chapter. So we're doing a lot of sort of explanation about how to use the book. We won't do this next time. So you'll find that next week's video will be more pointed because we'll be able to go right to the exercises here. I'm trying to explain some things you're going to have to do to better use the book. Again, you'll want to read this because it talks about reading and translation. Lexio translatio. This is important here. There are self-tutorial exercises in the back of the book. Let's see if I can find this here. So back to 21. I'm trying to go to 693, which I'm not sure where I'm going to end up. Oops, way too far. That's the problem with this Kindle or not problem, but it's not always precise. Nope. Okay, close enough then. All right, so in the back of your book, there are self-tutorial exercises. And you definitely want to do this. Why? Because you have an answer key as well. So after the self-tutorial exercises, it's not real long. It's like 20 pages or something like that. But each chapter has self-tutorial exercises. So it's very important. So for example, give the English pronouns equivalent to each of the following Latin personal endings. Well, T is third person singular. First is first person plural. Or mus is first person plural, excuse me. O is first person singular. Nuntines is third person plural. S is second person singular. Tis is second person plural. So if you go to the answer key, you're going to see exactly what I just told you. And so you want to go through these forms. One, because it kind of gives you practice using Latin for all those pages that we just kind of briefly talked about and you'll have to read. But two, because you have the answers, it's going to give you confidence. A lot of life, as you know, is just having confidence. And so especially since we're doing it with this format, you need something, when you're studying on your own to give you some confidence. Google Translate is good, but let's be honest, you still don't know it. And so I'm speaking as a language teacher. By the way, I read an article the other day that ChatGPT is the end of the take-home essay and paper. So I don't know if you enjoy writing or not, but I can see that is ChatGPT is very good, and we're all busy, we're all under stress, and people are going to use it, but at some point we have to understand what we're doing. Otherwise, I'm not sure why we're doing it. You can tell I'm a philosopher. If we don't understand it, then I would argue we really don't know it. So you want to use this to improve your understanding. And so the same thing, name the following forms and translate each. So mondere, these are all infinitives, and this means to advise, to see, to be well, to owe. And so you'll want to go through this and then look at the answers in order to give yourself some confidence. And then also if you have to post questions about the chapter using these, can be a good example of the kind of question you might have for me. So maybe I can give you other examples and explain it differently. Um, Again, this is one, not disadvantage, but it's one limitation perhaps of this format is I could give other examples because these examples may not work for everybody. And so you just have to communicate with me what you don't understand. And a lot of times just giving other examples, might, might, might just ring the bell, if you will. So take a look at that. I'm gonna go back to, again, I apologize. This is kind of, oops. Don't want to go that far back. No, no, no. This is next chapter, I believe. Yeah. So next chapter, you'll see we'll actually get into nouns, but that's next week. Okay. So again, you'll want to do these self-tutorial exercises in the back. They're very helpful. If nothing else, just do the odd numbers, if you will, but it'll just give you a little extra confidence. So please do that. All right, let's get into the actual lesson. So as a rule, we will be focused on the what's called the sententiae or the sententia antiquae, and this will largely be the basis for each test. And so you'll see, again, this is the first chapter, so it's not quite as complete as the future chapters will be. But each chapter has sententia antiquae, kind of based on ancient authors. Really can't see it here because you don't have enough Latin authors recognized for you to, might. So, but if you go to the next chapter, let me see if they have it here. Yeah. So already in the next chapter, you'll start to see here we have the words of Virgil. Here we have the words of Cicero. Here we have the words of Seneca. Here's Seneca. By the way, we have a lot of Cicero because Cicero, you don't need context, whereas literary writers oftentimes you need a little bit more context. So since we just have these simple sententia antiquae, these ancient sayings or sentences, but the point being is that that this will largely be the basis of each test, including the longer passage, which we'll talk about. But the first chapter, it's not really, I don't think they're really based on anything other than kind of the spirit of classical Latin. All right, so let's go through this here. So, and as a rule, we're going to do the first 10. Actually, maybe we'll do 11 too, since it's a good one. So you want to write this down. So, labor me vocat. So we have to know the vocab here. So labor, of course, is where we get the word labor. So it could mean labor or work, but again, it's not modern work. It's life was hard in the ancient world. It took Odysseus a long time to get home. It took Aeneas, Julius Caesar worked hard, and so it was life was hard back then. It's still hard, but we don't realize just how easy we have it. The Puritans, the colonists, they came here. They people walked 50 miles a day to go to California. I told my principal at the school I started working I'd like to organize a field trip to walk to Washington, D.C., and they looked at me like I was speaking some foreign language. So nowadays we tend, if something, again, let's be honest, it's easy. So back then, although it's not easy, but we have that sense perhaps. Back then, it took a lot of work to avoid becoming living a life of servitude or living a life of pain and suffering. And so you really had to work hard in the ancient world as today in order not to just, let life beat you up, if you will. So here it's labor me vocat, which means, again, we can say work, but what it really means is that hard work, but work calls me, or work is calling me. You got up in the morning at the crack of dawn, like was the case when we lived in an agrarian farm society, and farming is a lot of hard work. I've never done it, but my father did it. His grandfather did it. His father, rather, his grandfather in Wisconsin, and so It's a very satisfying work because there's something about work that's satisfying. Those of you that have you worked hard to get to Campbell and to college, and so at the time it sucked, right? You didn't want to listen to. Here I'm talking about my younger students. Don't want to listen to your teacher, your parents. We're just trying to encourage you to work on your own, and so as I try to tell the kids, they don't want to hear this, but without your parents and teachers, you wouldn't come to school on your own. You would sit at home playing video games, and of course they don't want to hear that, but they need the old philosopher like Dr. Thomas to tell them to put a little giddy up in their lives. So work calls me, or work is calling me. You do need to think about these because part of the test is to write a short essay in English about one of these classical sayings. More about that later. Again, I'm not looking for you to go out and read Aristotle in the original, but I think part of Latin is thinking. And if you were to have this, could you write 12 to 15 sentences in English about this? Of course you could, but requires a little bit of thinking. I think this is one of the virtues of Latin is right away it requires thinking. Duo, mone me si erro amibo te, is literally advise me or remind me, we might say, but advise me if I am making a mistake. Literally, advise me if I err. Please. This is how you say please in Latin. Literally, I will love you, but it's actually translated as please. So please tell me if I'm making a mistake. Mone me. So here we have the imperative form. Remember, monere, we had that earlier. We dropped the ending. Notice we don't have osmos tisnit here. So we need to be able to recognize this as the imperative form. So remind me if I am making a mistake. Here we do have osmos tisnit. Why? Because notice this word ends in O. So a couple things here. You have to be able to recognize what part of speech a word is. You need to be able to recognize by vocabulary study that this is a noun. Or not a noun, but a verb, excuse me. And then the ending will tell you exactly what it means. And this is the art of translation. Again, the nice thing about Latin, you keep doing the same thing over and again. At this point, it just may need to be memorized. As we get into more Latin, again, some of you may have a background in Latin. I will be using different charts and different explanations. But right now, I'm just kind of going over it and just treating this as vocab. But later, often you'll see I'll use declension charts to explain the endings. Festina lente. So lente here, remember, if you see italics, that's the translation. So lente means slowly. And then festino, festinare, to hasten or to make haste. And so this was a favorite saying of the Emperor Augustus. Of course, Caesar Augustus Octavian, the nephew of Julius Caesar, defeated Mark Antony and Cleopatra at the Battle of Actium in 31 BC. Famously said that I found Rome in rubble and I left it in marble. In other words, that Rome, what led to the downfall of the Roman Republic was civil wars. And then, of course, Rome emerged as an empire. But make haste slowly. In other words, go fast, but don't go so fast that you make mistakes. Right? Kind of true of life, right? Live as much as you can, do as much as you can, go as far as you can, but don't do it to where you're tired or you feel like you can't go any further. Just keep doing it. You got this. Festina lente. Once again, it's in the imperative. So again, verb, 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 noun, direct object, conjunction, direct object, adverb. Laudes me culpant me. This is where we get the word laudable. If somebody does something laudable, of course, it's praiseworthy. Excuse me. Culpant, if somebody's culpable, that means they're blameworthy in some sense. So again, we can see they give us the vocab. These are words in English that come from the Latin. So notice it ends in S. You should be able to recognize, of course, what person and number is this? You got it. Second person singular, you. So go back to our osmos tisnit. S means you, singular. So you praise me. And then NT, what person and number is that? If you said third person plural, you're exactly right. So they blame me, or censors. That seems a little bit too bureaucratic. Um, so they, or excuse me, you praise me. They blame me. Saipe pecamos. Again, pecco peccare means to sin. Of course, means that in your heart, your pecs, if you will. Peccadillo, impeccable. Um, we all feel it in our gut when we do something wrong, and so it's our inner life that is affected. Has nothing to do with uh, the world outside of us. That's the world inside of us is what the reference here is, of course. Saipe pecamos. Mus means we. So then we say we sin. So we say we and then whatever the word means. So pecamos, we, sin. Saipe means often. We had that earlier. So it's an adverb. So you could translate this as often we sin or we sin often. Um, Sin, of course, is more of ecclesiastical Latin. The Romans didn't have an idea of original sin, but they had, of course, profound sense of fate or fortune. Good luck, bad luck, quite frankly. The Greeks, of course, had tragedy, but I think we can. This is the idea of sin is more of a Christian notion. So we're talking about patristic literature, church fathers from the third to 6th centuries A.D. Which, by the way, is another reason why Latin is important. What's the common thread of ancient Rome and Christianity? Of course, it's Latin. So from 500 BC all the way until 1500 AD, 2,000 years, Latin was the language of the West. So just think about that, 2,000 years. How long has English been in existence? How long has American English been around? 250 years. So maybe 300 max. Saipe peccamus. We often sin. Quid debimus cogitare? We had this earlier. Remember Descartes? I think, therefore I am. So this means to think. Quid, we haven't had this yet. Again, that'll be true of a lot of things for a couple weeks. Quid means what? Mus means we. And then debi means ought or should. So what should we think? Or what ought we think? So it's kind of a rhetorical question. Conservate me means save me. So this is the imperative. Again, a lot of new concepts coming at you. Once again, nice thing about Latin, you keep repeating this stuff over and over again. In due time, we'll slow it down and look at charts. Right now, we're just kind of learning it as vocabulary. Conserve. So this is second person plural imperative. So save me. By the way, a lot of what we're doing here, you can see how important it is to do these self-tutorial exercises first. In fact, as your book points out, what I'm doing right now only will be a lot easier once you do this. So if we were in the classroom, we would do these before we do these. So this is something where you may want to pause the video and kind of make sure you're studying these first. And this will be true of every chapter before you go on to this. Because as a rule, I will not tell you every week to do this. You just need to do it. And so, but doing this, learning the vocab, so reading through the chapter, learning the vocab, and doing the self-tutorial exercises, you need to spend some time doing that. Otherwise, everything we're doing here that's going to be on the test is going to be just unclear, quite frankly. And so make sure you're doing those things first so that this is more intelligible. So second person plural. So you go back and study the concept, also taught in self-tutorial exercises. So it means save me. Save me. Yeah. Rumor volat, volo, something volatile or volleyball, right? Any volleyball players out there? Volare means to fly. Literally, the rumor flies. Probably in English, they rumors fly. Yeah, we all did that game when we were young, telephone, where I remember in first grade, second grade, you would go around the room and say something by the time we got to the other side. Who knows what people were thinking or hearing, rather. So, rumor volat, conspiracies. That was an important, not important, but conspiracies. That's when we think of politics, we think of conspiracies, telling rumors about your political enemies. Um, yeah, so rumors fly. Me non amat. He loves me not. We'll see later the locus classicus for that famous poem. But T, remember, T could mean he or she or it. I guess if you're talking about like a dog, for example. But here it's probably a person. So let's say he does not love me or she does not love me. Again, we don't have any context, so we don't really know if it's he or she. But amat. So number nine is a good one because it shows you the verb is at the end, which it often will be. So imagine you had a really long sentence, the verb's going to be all the way at the end. But then amat means he loves or he does love. So that could be, or he is loving. Um, but then we have may as the direct object and then the negation non. So here's a nice simple one that kind of really summarizes conceptually one of the things that you're going to have to get comfortable and learn in Latin is that Latin puts the verb at the end, generally has less words, and then you have to kind of think about what it means by grammar and translation. Nihil me terret, again, subject, object, verb. English prefers subject, verb, object. So nothing terrifies me. So nothing terrifies me, nothing scares me. Stoicism. We'll talk more about Stoicism in later lessons. And then the last one, Apollo, of course, the god of light. Fun fact, as some of you may know, Greek and Roman gods had different names, but Apollo had the same name both in Greek and Latin. God of light, god of music, god of poetry. Um, so Apollo saves me often. In other words, Apollo protects me often. It was Caesar or Cicero. He said, "We Romans owe our superiority to the belief in the gods." Rome, in many respects, was very barbaric. As you can imagine, it was the early stages of ancient civilization. In the words of Thomas Hobbes, life was nasty, brutish, and short. But they believed. They believed that work matters. They believe that it's important to carpe diem, seize the day. We don't live for eternity. You get one life, you better make the best of it. If we're making mistakes, it's the responsibility of parents. That's why parents were so strict back then to remind their children that I realize you don't like that, but that's going to get you killed in real life, and your life is going to be filled with pain and suffering and constant torment because that's the way the ancient world was. We don't really think like that anymore, but that's what it took to survive back then. Otherwise, you'd be living a life of destitute and poverty. And even then, you might still live that kind of life, but at least you have hope. And then, of course, right, sometimes we need help. We need love. Life is scary, terrifying, but, at some point you got to believe that there's more than light, than darkness. You also have the light of Apollo to help you believe in yourself. Of course, all that we just said would later be the Romans historically paved the way for Christianity. The West didn't just wake up one day and was Christian. The Romans and the Greeks prepared the spiritual maturation of the West in the form of Christianity in its earlier mindset. All right, so we're going to skip that right there. As I said, we'll generally do 1 to 10. Let's take a look at this here. This will be our last thing for today. Each chapter has a longer reading. This one's pretty short, but this one is The Poet Horace Contemplates an Invitation. Again, in the earlier part of your book, it talks about the major poets in the introductory material, so you'll want to read that. Horace is nice. He was born in 65 BC, and he was a contemporary of the great Roman writer Virgil and their patron Maecenas. And What's nice about Horace is he focuses a lot of things, but he wrote Carpe Diem, but he talks about the simplicity of, or rather happiness in the simple life, if you will. And so here he is vis-a-vis Rome, as you can imagine, like most modern cities, was a very complex urbs or city, and that's not for everybody, right? New York City is not for everybody. Most people are probably gonna probably prefer the simple life, and um, the writings of Horace focus on that. So let's go back. This is not real long. They're a little bit longer in the next chapters, but oh, here we go. So I thought there was a page here. So Horace Quintus Horatius Flaccus. There's his dates. You'll want to read this, but very important writer. Here he is with Virgil and Maecenas sitting around. This is, of course, an artistic representation. But nevertheless, you can see how this Wheelock is organized. Already right now you're getting some, no, this is adapted, but still some classical Latin in spirit. So let's read together. Maecenas et Vigilius me hodie vocant, quid cogitare debio, quid debio respondere, si erro me saepe monede culpant, si non erro me laudant, quid hodie cogitare debio. So what we got here is that Maecenas, who again is the patron, so rich nobleman, of aspiring artists, including Virgil and Horace, among others. So he's pretty important. You need support, starving artists. So Maecenas recognized their genius, their talent, and so he was happy to support their cause. And then Virgil is most famous for the Aeneid, which is after the Trojan War. Aeneas is, by the way, Caesar thought that Aeneas was one of his ancestors. So we'll talk about that in future lessons, but the Romans just believed that they were blessed by the gods to create a certain kind of civilization. And and so that belief in divine sanction, believing that the way you live your life is for happiness or salvation, probably makes a difference, if I'm being honest. The modern age, as you know, is, in the words of Friedrich Nietzsche, that modern men, with all their obtuseness to Christian nomenclature, no longer have an antique taste for the gruesome superlative God on the cross. I'm somewhat of an expert on Friedrich Nietzsche. Modern man is sort of privatized a lot of his values and virtues. The Romans was just the opposite. And life is complex, but one thing you can learn by studying the ancients and the classics is that Caesar, who was no sentimentalist, he actually believed that he came from Venus and Aeneas. And again, he was no sentimentalist. He was no dreamer. He was a great conqueror and statesman. And so if you're a dreamer, you're not out there conquering other armies. You'll get mowed down in an instant. And here's somebody like Caesar who was so matter-of-factual, and yet he believed that he descended from the gods. And so Virgil's Aeneid is really kind of, if not the key source, one of them, along with Ovid, for that Roman worldview. So Maecenas and Virgil. Now, when we translate it, you got to put it back in English. So we don't say Virgilius, we say Virgil. So you have to drop the IUS. Why? Because in English, his name is not Virgilius, but Virgil. And so keep that in mind, is that you have to put it back in the English form. Or translate it. So Maecenas and Virgil call me today. In other words, they're inviting me today. So the poet Horace contemplates an invitation. So they called me to visit them. So it's probably a big deal, right? Here's the Maecenas, very important patron. Virgil, up and coming great writer, and here's Horace being invited to contemplate the muses with these two men. So Maecenas and Virgil are calling me today. What ought I to think? In other words, what should I think about this? Why should I be nervous? Should I be excited? What do they want from me? Are they Are they going to make fun of me because I'm not a great poet, even though Virgil? And so you're in the midst of important people. You're going to be insecure. So he's thinking, what ought I to think? What ought I to respond? Now, already right here. So what ought I to respond? Um, this we see this in Horace's Carpe Diem is that, well, you got to believe in yourself. So let's say now this was not the case, but let's say they're calling you there to make fun of you, right? Some inferior poet, which because people do that, people did that, and still people still do that. Is you still got to believe enough in yourself, in your own thoughts, in yourself that you can't worry about what they think. If you want to be a poet and be true to yourself, you need to follow yourself, your own thoughts, your own heart, and your own convictions. And so perhaps that's one way to read this right here. What ought I to respond if I err? In other words, if I make a mistake, they will, or excuse me, they, now here in English, we probably say in the future tense, but we haven't had future tense. So if I make a mistake, they are often admonishing and blaming me. In other words, they're often correcting me. So literally, if I err, me often they blame, or excuse me, they advise and they blame. This is one where you have to be a little bit creative with your translation. So if I make a mistake, they, NT, often advise and blame me. Now, just like in English, we wouldn't put they twice, but here we have they advise, they blame. So this sentence right here is a little bit more complex, but I think we tried to explain it in a sensible manner. If I do not err, or if I don't make a mistake, they praise me. So if not I err, me they praise. Right? So think of like Yoda in Star Wars. Latin often has that sense of putting the verb at the end. Friend of the Force, you are. That kind of thing. So, si non erro me laudant. So, if I don't make a mistake, they praise me. What ought I to think today? In other words, about this invitation. So, literally, what today to think I ought. So, what should I? So, remember, debio means I. So, what should I think today about this invitation? All right, so, and then after that, you want to read through this. It just kind of talks about some graffiti and other things about Latin. Here, again, we're not doing any conversation, although this book is not really conversation, but here's kind of just basic conversational Latin. Some great art, and that's it. So, again, after we get a couple chapters under our belt, you'll see that the chapters are a little bit tighter than perhaps I presented today. We did a lot today trying to explain how the book is organized, things you need to do, self-tutorial exercises. A lot of stuff, we could spend hours on chapter 1. My advice to you is to read it a couple times and then focus on the self-tutorial exercises, the vocabulary, and the sententiae, and Horace contemplates an invitation. So for a lot of you, my advice is to just treat this as grammar and vocabulary and memorization. And then in time, the concepts and ideas, because again, you tend to repeat the same stuff over and over again in Latin, will become a little bit clearer. But that might take a couple chapters. All right, so I'm going to send this to you, and I'll send this as an email. Watch this when you can. As a rule, I'll record these videos on the weekend, but they might not be available to view until a Monday. And then as I'll indicate per email, if you have any questions, post them on the discussion board. I'll indicate this in my email, but as you know, I have another job, and so I don't check my Blackboard on a regular basis, if I'm being honest. And so if I don't respond to you right away, just be patient, I will. And then always feel free to email me or to come by during one of my German classes if you have a specific question. All right, enjoy and welcome to Latin 101 this fall semester 2023 at Campbell University. Vale te omnis.